Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and laughter stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, a comedy podcast to help you find your inspiration. I'm your host, Jason Farr. Let's do this. Great episode today with writer and comedian Alison Leiby. I really enjoyed talking to her. Heads up, there is a little noise you're going to hear in the background, the apartment above me still being renovated. Also, there are a couple of times, or maybe just once, when sirens go off in the background. So if you're driving while listening to this, no one is coming for you. At least I hope. I hope you've done nothing wrong to get the cops after you. But there are just going to be some sirens popping up. Don't be alarmed. This is a trigger warning all podcasts recorded in New York City apartments should reference, I think. On to today's episode. Alison has a great background in comedy, and she talks about it all, which is very informative, and I found what she had to say to be very encouraging as well. So let's just get right to it. Here's my chat with Alison Leiby. You do a ton of stuff. You've done a ton of stuff because you've worked on Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. You've worked on The Opposition with Jordan Klepper, which is a show I actually went to go see a couple of times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like
one of the few.
I did enjoy going. I mean, I think we went 2 or 3 times.
Oh, that's great. It's like the joy. Like, I mean, it's one of the things in New York that I wish more people knew that you could go, like, you know, it's an in and out hour, 90 minutes, you know, just to kind of like sit and watch TV get made. I don't know. I wish more people did it.
Yeah, it's actually super fun. And there are a ton of opportunities for that. Well, there were in New York. You've also worked on The President Show.
Yes, one of my favorites.
When did comedy become a part of your life?
I mean, you know, as a consumer of it, since I was, you know, anything I watched when I was younger. Like, I grew up in a funny house. Like, we watched a lot of, you know, Mel Brooks and The Simpsons. And, like, you know, definitely I was not, you know, late to, like, learn the classics by any means. But I didn't really do anything with it in a real way until, I mean, I did it in college. I was like, just really wanted to be an English professor and didn't really think about comedy as a career. But I interned at The Onion after I graduated.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Had a really good, that was like right when I moved to New York, and I was like 22 and had like an internship with the AV Club, but it was with the rest of The Onion, of course. And,
Right.
Worked there and started doing like a little bit of kind of like freelancing and blogging and things like that. And that was kind of the first professional comedy taste I had. But it was years before I ended up writing professionally or performing in any way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So what made you make that jump? Like, when did you start realizing, oh, I can actually do this?
Yeah, and it's just I think comedy is such an interesting and broad way to define a part of the entertainment industry. You know, comedy can mean different things to different people, but,
right.
You know, for me, it just felt like someone had to tell you that you were allowed to do those things, like that you had to be kind of like selected from some group, you know, or that you had to have been trained in a specific way. Like, I didn't really go through, you know, the performance schooling that so many of my friends who are improvisers or sketch writers and sketch actors had done, like UCB and the other, you know, in Chicago, you have IO and the Groundlings in LA. You know, I don't want to be an actress. And I was always like, stand-up was really appealing to me. And I just never thought that you could just start doing it. And then I learned that you could just start doing it. And I had kind of been in some other industries that kind of felt like they were circling being a professional writer. I worked in museums for a while, and I worked in book publishing for several years. And they were all just kind of like next to what I wanted to do. Like, it was just creative adjacent in so many ways. And I was like, wait, what I loved from that, you know, Onion internship and that kind of blogging freelance lifestyle that I had going on for a bit was that I liked being creative and being funny. So then I just started doing some storytelling and stand-up around town and was like, wait, this is all I want to do. This is how you do it? It seems it seems so easy, even though it is obviously not easy at all.
Right.
But the fact that it's just like, yeah, just start writing things and then going and performing them as often as humanly possible is the process. So once I learned what that was, I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I do this now.
Wow. Yeah, that is a journey that you took there then. And what did it take for you to start really swinging for the big roles that you've gotten? I mean, what was that developmental time period like that led you to getting real good gigs?
I mean, it was a very long, and I will always tell people like that it might look short. It might look like, oh, you got this job and then this job and then this job. But like the lead up to getting hired to do anything for 99% of people that do this is very, very long. I think I've been doing stand-up every night, from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., just grinding through open mics and then doing whatever shows I was booked on and kind of slowly getting on better and better shows and getting more established, and while having a 9 to 5 like data entry job that was just kind of a day job so I could make sure I had insurance and paid my bills, and then freelance writing and cranking out a weekly column for Eater and doing all these little like pieces for McSweeney's, and like just devoted my life to this for 5 years before I was even really invited to submit to maybe get jobs. It's a very it's like, well, usually it's through managers and agents that you get to submit to a writing job, which in late night means that they give you, some parameters for what they want, and you write somewhere between 2 and 15 pages of jokes for them. So then I started kind of getting packets here and there for submission, just from people who knew me from stand-up or, friends who worked at shows already who were like, you would be great. And I got close to some things, but, not like learning to write for TV is a separate skill. I think especially stand-up and late night go hand in hand, but you still have to learn how to write for someone else, which I hadn't done in the 5 years that I had been doing stand-up. So then I just kind of I became like kind of a packet queen and once I got a manager, and I just did every single submission packet. There was a year I think I did something like 40, which is crazy. But eventually and I got so close and so crushed so many times, because every time you do one, you think that this is the one you're going to get because you've poured all of this work into it for free. And you get the meeting and you're like, well, no one gets the meeting unless they're already getting hired. And it's like, that's objectively untrue, but something you tell yourself. And then, finally I had done I had worked on a couple of little like talk shows. And then I worked on an show that went for, a couple of months. And then I got Triumph the Insult Comic Dog. The election specials were my first really big, to me, job.
Oh, wow. Now that was one thing I hadn't heard about, that you did some Triumph stuff. That's great. I love Triumph.
Yeah, I do. It was like, growing up, Maisel was such a hero of mine.
Oh, yeah.
And I loved Triumph, but also like all of the TV Funhouse stuff, and it just everything. He's just, a legend if you're, someone who loves that part of like that world of comedy. So it was just, to get to do it. And, it wasn't, I usually don't lump it in as my first like real job, because it was mostly done remotely. And I didn't have kind of the writer's room experience that everything I've done since has, but that's just kind of how Maisel does it, especially with these, it was all, it's all on location. It's him going to conventions. It's him going to rallies. It's him this was in 2016. So, you're not bringing a staff of 20 with you. You just want like 20 funny people on their computers waiting for you to be like, we need jokes about this person because we're going to see them in an hour. So it was like a crash course in like becoming a joke machine, because they would email you at like 1 a.m. being like, tomorrow at 8, we're going to see Wolf Blitzer. We didn't think we were going to see him, so we need a whole bunch of stuff to say to him. And like then you crank out as many as you can, and at 3 a.m. you crash and you wake up at 7 to just like make sure you're sending in the right stuff. And it was a runaround, but it was so fun, and I just am endlessly so proud that I even got to work, in any capacity with him and with that show. And it was a very good experience. And then it was still another year, I think, before, and then the President show was the next thing. And it was more just that was the right first job for me because I had known Anthony for a long time. And I was close with a lot of people on that staff, and they knew me, and I had the right sensibilities for that show, which I think were actually very particular and narrower than the average late night show probably would have been.
Yeah. That's a pretty interesting process that you described there. So I want to talk about that Triumph experience a little bit of, having to write really quickly. How, and specifically talking about how to develop being a joke machine. How did you go about finding out how to do that?
I mean, it's part of that is a little bit of the breeding of being a stand-up, where you're just kind of going out every night, testing as many jokes as you can and fine tuning. And, I certainly knew how to structure jokes, in a very general sense, but pretty well at that point when I had gotten that job. But then it was interesting because instead of take the Tonight Show or any late night show and look at what the monologue is, it's we're going to do one joke about each of these things. And I'm sure people probably submit a couple jokes about some topics. But Smigel is all about quantity and quality, obviously, but him having a lot to choose from just because it is unscripted. It does not follow a traditional scripted monologue. I mean, he's just talking to someone and they don't know what else they're using and what else they're doing. And it's all getting edited together into a big thing later on. And so it's just how many options and angles do we have to make a joke about this person? So they would send us a person or a thing that was happening. And I would just sit there and just attack it I would spend an hour writing jokes about one person who I might not even know a lot about, just a CNN commentator or a senator from a state I don't live in. And all of a sudden you're just in Wikipedia being they voted on what, who, but learning well, how detailed is too irrelevant for a quick,
right.
This might be a 30-second segment. I can't be well, he voted for the Hyde Act. And that's
right.
Not super helpful for but at the same time, you don't just want to submit a bunch of jokes about what someone looks like because that,
right.
Gets very tiresome.
Right.
So it was just, it made me learn, and it wasn't always 1 a.m. to 8 a.m. There was plenty of times where we had a day to write stuff. But it was certainly you have to sit there and be what are all the different ways? And it's roasty style jokes, and those are pretty formulaic. But learning, I'm all right, well, if we're talking about Wolf Blitzer, I could talk about Wolf, but I can also talk about CNN as a entity or whatever. There's ways to kind of look at what are the different ways I can hit this joke, and then you just try and give as many as you can, but still cutting yourself off at a point where you're this is just going to overload. He's not going to read these after a certain point. There's too many. So it was a huge, I would say it was one of the jobs I learned the most about how to really write under pressure.
It's basically knowing joke structure, knowing different angles that one can take with a joke, and also knowing the different types of jokes that are out there. You have jokes about somebody's past and then also jokes about how they look or, just right. The different things like that. Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And then, and then it was so interesting to see kind of what was in the cut and then what was in the final show and cause those segments, obviously he picks some of his favorites and then he has somebody kind of waiting to be oh, well, here's a bunch of options. And then he just kind of goes. So it was nice to get to see what works, what doesn't, that kind of stuff is also really helpful. It was also helpful that I know Triumph's voice, but I know, what the character is and how he talks and jokes before I got hired for the job. So it was a little bit easier to, stay in his lane and write things that I knew made sense for what we were doing.
I love that. I love that process. Yeah. I mean, I was very curious about that, but then also hearing, you might get somebody that nothing about. So You have to just
that
do
was
a deep
always
dive.
pretty panicky. Yeah. And then you would know that, like, it won't be a long segment because unless something crazy happens, because you won't spend a ton of real estate in a show on someone that no one's heard of or no one knows very well, because there's just less to joke about unless, things go off the rails in a conversation. You couldn't predict, it was also like a learning experience and how how much time to spend on certain things. Cause like, that if he can get to Ted Cruz, it's going to be a much longer segment than if he's going to talk to, a freshman congressman that no one's heard of. So there was a lot of just kind of starting to understand like how TV gets made, and where to kind of spend your time and spend your energy as a writer, so that you're getting as much good stuff out there for them as you can, but not like just spinning your wheels, cranking out garbage that's truly never going to see the light of day.
Yeah, and also with writing so much and knowing that there's just a lot of material that's coming out, it explains why he has sheets of paper with him when he's doing like the man on the street type bits, or like at MTV Video Music Awards and he's making fun of Eminem and you see that he's holding sheets of papers. That's where the jokes are, and he's also like on the spot sort of choosing what to go with.
Yeah, which is, it just shows what his mind is forever fascinating to me, and he's so brilliant. And just to be able to scan that sheet and know exactly the direction he's going to go, and then still deliver it as Triumph and still like respond as Triumph with something that's not scripted is incredible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's super fascinating because you have to be such a good listener, and you also have to be aware of what's on the sheet, and when somebody says something, saying like, "Oh, I know there's a joke about that. Let me get to that real quick," and you just have to be so sharp in every way, really, to do what he's doing. Yeah, he's a genius and one of the greats.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to have been able to be a part of that, just because it seemed like also after 2016, while there was also a ton of like more political comedy being done, I don't think there was as much room for, I'm sad there was not more Triumph stuff to do. So I'm very glad that I got to do it when I did.
Yeah, that's great. I've said it a few times, you've done so much in terms of different projects you've worked on, but you've also had such an interesting variety of the work because you've done stand-up, but you've also been a writer and have gotten stuff that appeared in the New York Times and also a television writer, which I feel like while there are a lot of people who have done that, it's not as common to have such a varying approach.
I don't think so either. I mean, I don't want to believe like I'm so special, I did all these things, but sometimes when I look back, just as I'm kind of taking stock of like what's next and what am I doing, like it does feel like it's been a very robust kind of approach and journey through comedy writing.
Yeah,
in all its different forms.
Have you found that has opened up opportunities, or have you hit certain roadblocks in some places where people are like, well, you sound like someone who does this and that's not really what we need to do? Or do they do they accept that with open arms and say like, oh, well, you can do all these different things, that's going to be utilized well here?
Right. I mean, I do think that ultimately I'm sure that it has helped me get plenty of things. I was very worried when the opposition got canceled and I was kind of like looking out at what was next, that people would see me just as this, political comedy writer, and that I would just kind of be stuck in that world. And I was like struggling to get my pilot kind of finished. And I felt very just like, I'm a person who writes for men who sit at desks. That's what I do. And when Maisel came along, I was like so nervous that like without the narrative experience that I wouldn't be fit for that. But I also am a female stand-up, and I think that that's something that helped me kind of be appealing to the show in that way. I have to imagine. But that also that I've written prose, that I've written all this other stuff, that like I think it did kind of create this like, okay, maybe I haven't done this one specific thing, but like you can see I've done all of this other kind of writing that informs you of what kind of writer I am. And all I'm learning as I go through this career is that the different kind of parts of writing comedy and writing, for humor, it's all just kind of learning the rules of that little corner of the industry. Like, there's so many people who I feel are boxed out from political comedy writing because, like, writing for a show like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight, there's a format that you need to learn. And once you learn that format, both in, like, how a teleprompter works, but also just in kind of like how those jokes sound and how video is placed within a story, you're like, oh, this is easy. But unless you really like learn that and know that and have access to learning about those things, it can be very exclusionary. And I think that, like, I felt that way about narrative, and I've been able to kind of jump into that world very luckily. And I'm sure that, like, other people feel that about different, stand-up might feel crazy to people who are improvisers. And
Right.
And I think that improv is insane. And they're like, you're still a writer. It's just the game. But I'm like, I'm not an actress. But I think, like, ultimately it always, to find more ways, finding as many ways to be funny as you can is always just helpful for people trying to imagine you being funny for them.
Right.
Like, if I could be funny for the New York Times and for Robert Smigel and for an pop culture show, like, then yeah, there's probably a world in the middle of that triangle that you can see me writing for you if you're one of a few different things. So I think it helps. I don't think it's, like, necessary for anybody to just be like, well, I can't be a TV writer unless I'm in the New York Times writing a humor column.
Right.
Like, that's not, I don't think that, like, I hope that nobody feels that, because I think that that's untrue. But
I would agree.
It doesn't hurt you.
Yeah, it's definitely, I find it impressive, but I've also seen that run up early, not in the entertainment business so much, but in just the office world, where people are like, well, you seem like a jack of all trades and a master of none sort of thing. And it's like, is that just an excuse? Because to me, if you can do a lot of things,
right. You can, and especially if you've figured out how to do a lot of things, it means that you can also continue to learn how to do new, different things.
Right. Which is mastery. Being able to do different things is in itself a masterful skill.
I agree.
I'm not familiar with how the writing is structured for Ms. Maisel, because obviously there's somebody writing the stand-up and there's somebody writing the story. I don't know if that's the same people or if it's sort of spread out among different groups within the writing team. How is that structured there?
It's a very small staff. There's only 5 or 6 of us, plus Amy and Dan, who are the co-creators, executive producers, brilliant leaders of the show. And and then it's a couple playwrights and a couple stand-ups, and we all kind of work together to figure out what this, Amy and Dan always have a very, like, not a very clear, but they have an idea, like, they've had an idea, it's their show. They have an idea of what they want to happen with all of these characters. And we kind of all together, the people who come from a playwriting background, there's me and 2 other stand-ups on the staff who, have written for other shows and are writers. In addition to being stand-ups, I lump us all together as just like, we're all writers. Kind of work together to both develop, like, what the story is for the season for all these different characters, and also kind of how does the stand-up fit in. I think, one of the, what's the opposite of a criticism? Compliments that the show gets is that the stand-up usually does compliment the other spelling the action in the show, and so it is all, you can tell that it's, like, written. It's not just like somebody writes a bunch of stand-up in a room and is like, just drop this in. And we all collectively contribute to all of that in a really nice way. I think, like, certainly me and the other Noah Garden Schwartz and Jordan Temple are the other stand-ups. And I think that we probably end up writing more, like, pitching more stand-up stuff just because we're like, I know what this world is. I know what this sounds like. But, like, I mean, there's, like, jokes in the stand-up from, playwrights, and Amy and Dan write so much of it. And we contribute storyline idea. It's really a nice group effort.
Nice. Is there a challenge in writing, since the show is set in the 50s or 60s, right?
Yeah. Well, we just got into 1960 in season 3.
Okay.
So we're in 1960 in season 4. I forget, but yeah, it's that time.
Since stand-up was so different then, and then also the culture was so different, is it hard or is there a challenge to writing material for that time period, in a time period that the audience is mostly removed from? A lot of young people watch the show and they didn't live then. They don't necessarily get the references. So is there a challenge in trying to write that in that old school voice?
There is and there isn't. I think that like Midge, I personally think that Midge feels kind of modern in some ways, but then also still is, of course, of 1958 and in the way she does a lot of things. But her perspectives, I feel like, are a little more modern, and like I think that's what makes the character so interesting. And how she feels about certain things, I think is not as far a leap for us writing it. But really knowing what the references would be, what she would even be talking about, and just kind of like, I loved Joan Rivers like through and through as a stand-up. Like I remember watching so many videos of her and just thinking that she was, incredible. And so that the joke structures and like the way that comedy sounded from that era is not super foreign to me. I think we've all kind of done our research too to kind of learn. So it's kind of almost just a fun exercise of like, I often, when I'm pitching jokes for it, when we get the scripts or when we're like looking at what it might be, I'm like, well, what would I end up talking about if I lived in 1960? Like, how would I end up saying that? Because she's a Jewish woman, the Upper West Side. Like I feel very like connected to her. But I usually just try and approach it a little bit with like, what's a joke that I think is funny that she would think is funny, and like, does it sound of that era? But it is hard. It is writing almost in a different. It's writing for a different time period, but it feels like it's almost like a different character.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's one thing when people write, like you wrote for Triumph the Insult comic. So you're writing for a particular voice, but when that voice also has to have this sort of other style or reference other things that aren't necessarily current. At least it helps that she is, like you were saying, someone who has a sensibility that's very modern. She's way ahead of her time.
Her being a woman getting on stage at all in that era would have been,
that
would have made her inherently like a little edgy or progressive or whatever word you want to use to describe that kind of like pushing forward in culture.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. You also were a producer of Ilana Glazer's special, her Amazon special.
Yes.
What does producing a stand-up special entail exactly?
It means different things to different people and different specials, and producer is one of those insane titles in the entertainment industry that it's basically the same as consultant in, corporate America. I think it's very, there are people who are producers who are, figuring out a line budget of a show. And there are people who are producers who are writers, and there are people who are producers who are just collecting money on the back end. So I'm not that one. In this context, Ilana and I met years ago at a stand-up show we were just both booked on. This was like, she was like pretty into Broad City already. It was like maybe season 2 or something like that. And she was kind of getting back into stand-up after having been doing the show for a bit. And she saw me on a show, and we just like, she just like DM'd me and was like, can we meet for a drink? Like, I want to talk to you about comedy. And became like great friends who just like loved kind of like working on jokes together and kind of looking at, okay, so I want to talk about this. Like, all right, well, let's talk through like what you want to say and kind of like bounce jokes off of each other. So when she decided to do a special, that was just kind of an extension of that role. So kind of helping her kind of like navigate through putting together this hour, and helping her kind of figure out how to get those jokes in the best shape. And so we would go out and do shows together, and, then we would like kind of listen to tapes and talk about like should we move something? Should we, it felt a lot like writing for television, in a way where it's like you have someone's vision and you're just like, how can I help you make this, the best it can be? So just kind of like helping with jokes and kind of structuring stand up and trying to make it as tight and fun for the audience as possible. So it was really, it's my favorite thing to do is just work on jokes with people.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that's nice to hear. I feel like stand-ups have a rap for, I guess not being helpful, but, there's so many people who are helpful in the industry. I mean, I think Neil Brennan helped Ellen with her last special. Lots of people help people. Yeah. It's
very common.
Yeah.
It gets a strange, people are like, someone's writing for you. And I'm like, yeah, but like, even when I get on stage, like there's stuff that I say on stage that someone has helped me kind of shape and form and understand a little bit, like make it a little bit tighter. And it's like, and I'm not a big successful stand-up. I'm still like everyone, that's the process of stand-up. Like it's so rarely done. Alone in a room in a vacuum.
Right. And, I mean, even at open mics, people will say like, hey, there's this thing that I don't get. You. Right. Or some sort of structure thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find it I find stand up to be like a shockingly collaborative art form, I guess. I hate calling it an art form. But whatever it is, performance. It like I have so many friends who my friend Josh Gondelman will text me and he's like, do you want to get together? This was before COVID. He'd be like, do you want to get together on Sunday and just kind of like go over some premises? Because I need some help kind of making myself write this. And I'm like, oh yeah, and we'll each bring a couple things that we're trying to work out and, go back and forth, just talking it out and giving each other notes and tags and how to make it funnier. And it's delightful to do. And then you go try it out at a show and you're like, oh my God, that worked so well. Or you text them and you're like, that was a nightmare. Why did you tell me to say that? So I find it to be very collaborative. And this was just kind of a formalized version of that, producing for Ilana.
Yeah. You mentioned improv sounding crazy to you, but that process you're talking about is a lot like what, at its heart, at its core, what improv is. It's a group of people doing that on stage. Someone comes up with an idea and then other people are like, well, here's something I think that can help that idea.
Yeah. I tend to find, I feel like when I was early in stand-up, I was like, ugh, gross, improv. There's always that at odds nature of those two comedy forms because they seem like the antithesis of each other. But at the end of the day, I am most satisfied with collaborative writing. And I thought that I wasn't for so long because I did so much, writing, funny TV recaps in my early days of having to freelance and writing, some of the humor pieces I've done and writing stand-up. I thought I was doing that by myself. And I've learned, through my jobs in TV, but also when I really look at how my comedy, my stand-up comedy has evolved. And when I'm working on a script, I have a writing partner right now who I adore writing with, and it's more every time one of us has an idea for something to work on, we're just I'd rather just bring this to you and do it with you because it's more fun and inherently better when there's two people or more that are kind of helping this thing kind of become a reality. I think there are some, tortured artists who are I must do it all alone, and that's another awful legacy that Louis C.K. left us. But there are I think that the more I'm very more the merrier when it comes to comedy writing at this point. And I love getting in a room together and kind of being able to make something funny.
Yeah. Why don't you, was it comedy or stand up that you were saying you don't like to call an art form?
I was stand up.
Oh, okay.
Just not because I don't think that it is artistic expression, but people get all high horse.
Oh, right.
High horse about this is the only real art. And I'm like, don't call it art. We're still just, this is not,
True.
I just don't like when people take it too seriously.
I don't either. Yeah.
Art form. Stand up is inherently an art form, but when people get all,
high and mighty
about
right.
it being taken as this truth telling, and I'm like, I don't know. I have like a 10-minute bit about like buying an expensive cactus at a store. I don't know if this is like high art or the cultural criticism that you wish it was.
Yeah,
but the people who think of like that are the ones who have the least fun with it. I'm like, it's comedy. It's inherent. Like, we're just supposed to be making people laugh. The fun of it. Like, I think it's fun, and it should be fun for everyone.
Right. I totally agree. And I there's a lot of, I guess, like truth-telling comedy that I've enjoyed, but I've never enjoyed when people do get kind of on a pedestal and talk in those terms of like, use your platform to talk about da 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 da. And I just sort of resent it because it does seem to take the fun out of it and make it about something that I'm not even sure they have as much control over. I don't know where I land on that whole, how much of an impact can it really make? Because, on the one hand, I know how certain specials have made me think about something, it has challenged me in some sort of way. Like, that's a real thing. But, people, I do think, sometimes treat stand-ups as senators on the floor speaking to the nation and getting votes changed, and it just doesn't have that impact, I don't think. I mean, it can change it.
Yeah, it can. I don't know. I like believing that there is stand-up and comedy in the greater sense that can really push social change, and I think that there are definitely examples from the history of like what can be considered comedy and shows that have changed how we think about things, and stand-ups who have like really like articulated something that no one's been able to articulate about what happens in our culture. And those things are great and meaningful and important, but like, as long as they're still in the service of making comedy, but once they're not in the service of making comedy anymore, then you're like, well, what am I looking at?
Right. Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah. I think, there was something recently Jon Stewart was saying when his biggest regret was sort of, I guess, sometimes sort of playing into that, like annihilate, like we're gonna take this down. Does this speak enough truth? Like that sort of thing. Not that I don't think that he like very actively was like, let's speak truth to power and change things. I don't think he did that, but
no, I think it evolved slowly into that, and then all of a sudden, that's like what our whole television political comedy culture was like.
I think people learned the wrong lesson from that show, because I've even heard people say, if he had been the host of The Daily Show in 2016, Hillary would have won. And the thing is, he was the host of The Daily Show both times W. Bush won. So I don't think it has that kind of impact. I think a lot of times people are preaching to the choir, and they may be ahead of the curve, but they are still just saying things within your frame of thinking anyway.
Right. It's not. There are not a lot of like, Trump or even undecided voters that are sitting down and watching The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight or even
and doing a 180.
I don't know that that's happening. We shouldn't expect like these shows to be able to change anything, and if they do, that is just a added bonus.
Right.
Because if they're supposed to be changing things, then you need to put them on CNN, and you need to put them on, and they're not comedy shows anymore.
Right.
That's fine, but they're not comedy. It was one of the challenges with The Opposition and The President Show, which both kind of tackled the very heavy, President Show obviously embodying Trump and like finding a way to like, how do we take this like reality show host nightmare who's running our country into the ground and like put him back on TV in a way that like is satirical, but also still funny, which I personally think we did, but I don't think everybody would agree. That's fine. And The Opposition too, which was supposed to be kind of like a zoomed in look at like what is happening with these like culture warrior, fringe alt-right conservatives. And it's like, well, now we're kind of just talking about them. And I'm not sure how I think we made it funny as much as we could, but at the end of the day, like both of those shows are inherently not, built just to be comedies.
Right.
And that's like why I think they're set up to fail. It's because people are like, well, this was funny, but it wasn't the hard-hitting thing I wanted. Or, well, this made a really good point, but it stopped being funny. And it's like, those shows can't win, which I think is unfortunate because writing satire can be very cathartic. And I think that both of those shows had some of the like funnier jokes that I've gotten to write as a comedy writer. But you know, it's a tough corner to put a television show in, or to put a stand-up in, or a, you know, whatever you're looking at, to be like, you have to both be the truth teller and save us, but you also have to be really funny doing it. Because I'm not sure that anybody's ever actually done that.
I don't either. And I think some people think that that's what the court jester did, but
yeah,
I don't know that really, I don't think that really happened. I don't know. I mean,
I don't know.
I'd have to, I guess, study that to see. I'd be curious if there were, because some people have talked about like the court jester being able to say things that no one else could say, and you know, to the king. But I don't know that the king said, you know what, on second thought, I'm going to do something completely different than what I was thinking before because you made that joke. I have not personally seen or personally experienced a comedy special making me do a 180 on the way I was thinking.
No.
If I disagreed, I disagreed. And it doesn't matter if the joke was funny or not. If it's wrong to me, I don't think it's funny. So, you know.
Right. It's hard. And it's a hard, like, I feel like comedy has gotten pushed into being either like this like super fluffy, you know, family sitcoms, and like very surface feeling stand-up, because in comparison, the alternatives are these like heavy hitting man at desk shows.
Right.
That, like,
there's nothing in the middle.
The dark, or like a really dark, serious, you know, satire of, you know, whatever awful thing that we want to talk about this time. And it's just like, there's actually, or like, you know, or a stand-up who's like, I'm going to spend a whole special talking about, you know, something super dark, or like telling you truths that you don't want to hear. And it's like, well, where's the in-between? There isn't a ton anymore. And I hope, you know, I hope that we start coming back, you know, not the middle politically, but like the middle of like the spectrum of, you know, what comedy can look like, and that there can be like silliness, that every once in a while you make a point, but otherwise you're just being silly. You know, I think it's a little polarized right now. It's a little tough to, you know, you look at Maisel, which is this like beautiful, like escape to, you know, 1960, which is that better? I don't know. Like, but it's this like gorgeous, goes down smooth, you know, fun, witty, charming show. And then like John Oliver, like those are your options. It feels like sometimes.
Right.
And there's not a lot in between.
I agree. I mean, I'm a fan of I would say most of the people doing late night shows, but you know, you do have the serious stuff, or you have like, you know, Fallon is doing stuff that's on the silly side because he wants to be an escape. That's what he wants the show to be. He wants it to just be like games and goofing around because he just wants you to take a load off. I recently heard Conan talking. He went to the Oxford Union and he was talking about this, and he said it seems like it's a lot of political stuff, but then you have the like Jimmy Fallon, James Corden stuff, and he said he likes to find a way in the middle where he's not doing really either. I mean, he obviously is on the silly side, but he's not playing games. Yeah. He's kind of irreverent.
Yeah, he's always kind of straddled the line a little bit. Yeah, he's very irreverent and a little bit different, and like doesn't mind like having a bit more of a point of view that isn't necessarily just a political one. Right,
yeah. He's kind of old school in that regard. I mean, he's of more that Letterman sort of approach to comedy, but he was the one. He's the only one who's been on since '93. So I guess that's why
it's true.
I guess Kimmel really has a little bit of that.
It works.
Yeah. Well, I just think all of this is really, really great to talk to you about. You have a really interesting perspective on these things.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're very welcome.
I spend all day in my apartment thinking about it. So.
Well, we've reached the end of the episode so quickly. I don't even know how that happened. But
time doesn't mean anything anymore. I think that's part of it.
That's very true. So let's create something together, and I'm trying to decide what that could be. I mean, you talked about I loved you talking about the process with Triumph the Insult comic. Like if you get an assignment and it's like, oh, I've got very little time here to work on this. I don't want to make you do the taxing work, but I am interested in hearing what that process would be like.
Oh, sure.
So could we go over that?
Yeah, we could do that.
Awesome. So let's say we get a celebrity, and let's say we don't know much about this celebrity. So let's I'm just going to go to the news right now. Just pick a name of somebody who is trending or in the news. And
it's going to be a real dealer's choice there of what you're going to end up with.
For sure.
That means day too, so I'm sure you'll see a lot of famous people's names.
Yeah, I'm trying to find. Let's see. I don't want to do that. Let's see. Okay, let's say, not that I want to make jokes about her because I love her, but Nicki Minaj. She's just the name that came up then.
Sure.
So if someone's like, okay, Triumph is going to be able to talk to Nicki Minaj, where do we begin?
For Triumph.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And I also, even though it's always tricky, I like doing something about appearance if you can. If there's a way, I have plenty of my own personal code for what I think is appropriate or not appropriate for talking about what someone looks like. I feel like usually I go to clothes because that is not inherently as insulting, I think.
Right, yeah, you definitely don't want to talk about somebody's body.
Yeah, so and I think our culture, 2015 and now, we talk about everything differently. So it's so interesting to even be posed with this because what I would have said in 2015 would have been much meaner. But you could, I would start in if you knew what she was going to be wearing, you would definitely kind of maybe start with that. I always think that starting with something that's physical and obvious is just really easy because it's the first thing a viewer is seeing, at least working with Triumph. So the first thing out of his mouth is going to have to be something that you get just by seeing this person for 1 or 2 seconds or having an introduction of maybe just their name and their title. So find something physical. It's hard if you don't know what that person's going to be wearing. So many of the Republicans and Democrats at all of the events that we would cover just really dressed poorly. So it was pretty easy to just make fun of their ill-fitting suits. But for Nicki, she certainly has a personal style that would be fun to write some jokes about, even though now I can't think of any. But I would start with that. And then it would just depend on why we're talking to her. At the conventions, it was one thing to know why are we talking to Ted Cruz? Because he's a piece of garbage. Because he was there and he's obviously had a role and we knew exactly he was the speaker or something. So I always like to joke about why someone is there. If we're at the Grammys, it's are you just here to defend your title of best nails on any performer? What if you? That's a very nice joke.
Right.
But kind of just contextualize why we're there, why we're talking to this person, what this person is doing, talking to us. And then I always like to make a lot of jokes about if I can make fun of 2 things at once, I would really like to. So if there was someone else that you could make a joke about in addition to Nicki in one sentence,
right?
You do it. That's always, and it's hard for me to come up with something on the spot without a ton of context.
Right, it's an old reference now, but I guess the beef that she had with Cardi B could have been at one point that would be one direction to go.
Right, or you could also. I always loved doing do you think that you're the blank of blank?
Right.
So you're making fun of the person, but you can also bring in somebody else that you want to make a reference to, or make fun of the industry as a whole. And I always like to do a couple of those and find a couple of ways. It's the old roast joke that it's a structure I always really liked, even though it's very disgusting. But I wouldn't bone you with blanks
Right.
Swear on this, but like
that's fine. That's fine.
That way you insult two people at once, and that was always like a very fun. Like if you could get that right, it's just a delight to do. And then I always wanted, at least when I would submit for Triumph, like one or two jokes that are like absurd and like a little weird and just kind of like a surprise to hear, like something that kind of has like nothing to do with all the obvious things that someone would say if they were interviewing her for a comedy thing, and try and find either one like bizarre fact about her that other people don't really talk about or isn't like kind of in the top 10 things you think of when you think of Nikki, or just like go fully irreverent and like ask like who she's voting for, even that's like not even a good example, but like something like do something that's like a little outside of like the scope of what you're doing, because like it's good to have those on hand, especially if the path you're going down isn't working.
Right. Good.
Yeah, and kind of and just try and like and then like obviously you would write like a couple jokes about like the basics of like, you know, why she's famous, what her songs are like, you know, her hilarious videos, like, and just like making, you know, write at, you know, for Triumph I would write at least two or three jokes for each like thing that somebody was known for.
Okay.
And just get all those angles, and then hopefully you have a page of stuff that somebody eventually reads.
And was there a finesse to how to make the "for me to poop on" joke? Was there a way that you had to try to surprise the audience with that, since that was something people were expecting to come?
I typically did not submit anything that fell under the "for me to poop on" structure, just because I knew that he would get that in regardless. But I, as a newer writer to that circle, I always felt like, you know, that was going to get covered by somebody. So how can I bring a voice that's like a little bit different? Right. And that Maisel probably could just like, you know, crank out a million of those jokes at any point.
For sure. Probably just on the spot, he probably just finds a way to.
I
great.
think so.
Well, awesome. There it is.
That's how you write jokes, apparently.
Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast, Alison.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun. So nice to talk to someone.
And that was a great talk. Big thanks to her for coming on. You can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Alison Leiby. That's Leiby, links in bio. She has a new podcast coming out August 25th called Ruined. Check that out wherever you get podcasts. Also, she mentioned Keisha Zoller and Josh Gondelman both have been on our podcast, and they are two of my favorite episodes. So if you haven't already, go check those episodes out. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ThereItIsPod. Also subscribe to our comedy lifestyle newsletter and support us if you can. Go to ThereItIsPod.com. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.